Hi, everyone. It's great to see so many of you here, and hope there are going to be some interesting insights for you. We also have Q&A later today. But first off, as Siv said, I wanted to share a little bit more about the book that we have recently published, and that is really about being born global and what are some of the best practices and learnings on how to win in the US. And yeah, by a little intro, my name is Kati. I'm a partner at Index. I'm based in Berlin, but Index has actually been around for 30 years and of all places started in Geneva in Switzerland. And over the last 30 years, we've expanded to London and now also have offices in New York and San Francisco. About 50% of the investments that we make and the dollars that we deploy are deployed in the US and the other 50% here in Europe. So we're a truly global fund and yeah, have been fortunate to partner with a range of amazing companies over these years. We were lucky to be the seed investor in Figma, who has gone public recently, and also partnered early with companies like Wiz and Scale. So it's been an exciting year for us. And throughout these 30 years, we also realized like how helpful it can be to provide a signal in the noise. So I hope some of you are familiar with the option calculator that we've put out there and the Not Optional campaign, which was one of our first initiatives to actually help founders and also employees figure out, hey, what's actually a typical market salary, a typical market options package that you receive in a certain role. And from there on, we've published a number of other research projects. Last year, we published a book called Scaling Through Chaos, which is about how you scale from 0 to 1,000 people and what are some of the best practices. And this year, we published Winning in the US, which is really a guide on how to expand into the US and win in the US that has been refreshed from some of the research that we've done 5 years ago. And so for that, you see a couple of people that we've interviewed here. We analyzed the data of 500 companies. We conducted 40 in-depth interviews with the likes of Peter from Adyen, Eleanor from Pigment, Matti from 11 Labs, and Nick from Revolut. And one of the really interesting things, if we go to the next slide, has been that there is no one-size-fits-it-all approach to how you go into the US. And instead, you really want to think through what your business model is and what the type of company is that you're building. And there's a couple of dimensions to that. First of all, thinking, how big is your market in the US? What percentage of your market is in the US? Is it more like 20%? Is it more like over 50%? Then are you more a sales-led company? Are you more a marketing-led company? And how big is your need actually for local operations on the ground? And depending on that, we actually defined 5 archetypes of companies that all have a different profile and footprint into the US. Something that we actually didn't really cover in the book was the transplant. That's companies that have European founders, like Patrick Collison of Stripe or Severin Hacker of Duolingo, that directly initially start their company in the US, like, and fully feel like a US transplant. But then if you look kind of further to the left, what we also found is basically on the other side are companies that are what we call a telescope. So if you think about gaming companies like King and Supercell, which are very marketing driven, don't need local ops, have like basically drive their revenue through a lot of performance marketing, they can have a really big US customer and revenue base without having any local operations at all, but drive basically everything from Europe. Then kind of the next profile, the anchor, is if you have like very targeted US operations. So Revolut, for example, they treated the US almost with everything like a new experiment. Okay, kind of how do we approach this as an entirely new market? Send a small team there, experiment, and see what sticks. But the majority of both Adyen's and Revolut's operations are in Europe, remain in Europe. It's like where most of their business are. And then probably the 2 archetypes that are most relevant, I would imagine, for the crowd here, because also that's what most B2B software startups tend to fall into, is the category of Pendulum and Magnet. Pendulum is if you really have a balanced approach, where often, and I'll speak about this with Max from Taktile, because I would say that's kind of the archetype that they fit into, is where often the CEO moves to the US, but actually R&D, product and tech remains in Europe. And you take basically the best of both worlds. And then the magnet companies like Incident, Calibra is where really like a lot of the weight shifts towards the US, but you still have some operations also in Europe. So basically just the takeaway is there's no one-size-fits-it-all approach. And as you're thinking about moving to the US or expanding into the US, really go through a couple of dimensions and see what's the best model for you. I thought what's also interesting is some of the data that we came across in our research. And first of all, what has been really interesting to see is that when founders move to the US has almost flipped on its head from a couple of years ago. So when you look at the period between 2015 and 2019, only about a third of the companies had actually a footprint in the US, like during their pre-seed seed stage. And what we found kind of were companies that started between 2020 and 2024, which is certainly also driven by what was going on during the COVID pandemic, is that actually 2/3 of the companies had already some US footprint, some US affiliation by kind of their pre-seed and seed round. And one of my colleagues basically always almost said that like, as a move, like burn the ships, people have moved to the US and like started out there. But that's, as I said, only one of the archetypes. Then when we looked into what drives companies and people to the US, it's interestingly actually not that much the capital. The investors come here to Europe as well. You have by now a bunch of capital that's accessible, but it's really the customers. So 3/4 of the companies we spoke with cited customers as their primary reason for moving to the US. And what we have seen is that they're often, especially in the B2B software space, it's just a different discussion. It's much less about, hey, do we have budget for something? But it's like, okay, if you show me the ROI, I'm happy to buy and I'm happy to take more risk. It's also that the US software market is just twice the size of the European software market. So there's just also kind of a larger pie for a lot of companies. And then if you go back one slide again, Lewis. I know, and like I already talked a little bit about willingness to adopt technology. Is just people are a lot more risk-taking. And what we've seen, sadly, sometimes is people here in Europe want to see, or like once a US customer buys, then they're happy to buy here as well, which is, I hope, something that will change eventually. Something that's really interesting is that we also see a lot of companies take that kind of best of both worlds approach. So a lot of the companies actually had not a big footprint from an R&D perspective in the US by the time they even hit Series D. So only 12% of their R&D headcount was in the US by Series D. And that's something where we see that in Europe, obviously, you still have a bit of a cost advantage, or quite a big cost advantage versus hiring engineers in the US. You also have higher retention, more loyalty, people, and often it's also kind of, you have a bit of a talent advantage here by being local, as you're competing kind of with the US native companies in the US. So we see that that's a popular model. And then talking about a little bit what are actually, if you're deciding to move to the US, what is actually the city that's right for you? And it was quite interesting because I think a lot of people thought, okay, San Francisco and the Valley is dead, like everything's moving to New York. And what probably many of you have seen as well is that with AI, there's just been a massive comeback. And if you're building kind of in AI, especially further down the stack, then actually many people still today choose to relocate to the Bay Area. However, what is also very popular is obviously New York, and the two major aspects why people choose that is, number one, the time zone, that if you especially if you retain a team in Europe, it's obviously easier to communicate across 6 hours of time difference rather than 9. And then customers is a big point too. So if you're building in the finance space, healthcare space, media, consumer, that's all sectors where probably a lot more of your customers are going to be on the East Coast than on the West Coast. And yeah, I guess the last insight that I thought was interesting is that just how much timelines have compressed. I mean, we already talked about how much earlier people actually moved to the US, but what's interesting is also how you can actually see in the data how much faster companies have scaled headcount, that by now, basically, by year 4, companies have often already twice the headcount that they had a number of years ago. And at the same time, what's quite interesting, and that's certainly a bit AI-driven, that at the same size, they already have around 20% more ARR. So companies have definitely become more efficient in their scaling. And so yeah, that was just a few data snippets to get you set up for the conversation with Max. There's a lot more in the book, and the full book is also online. So if you're not a hard copy reader, you can also just go to our website or to winningintheus.com and see the full book. And yeah, with that, I'm happy to invite Max to the stage.
Hi, everybody. Super excited to see so many of you being interested in building big global companies from Berlin, which is something I'm passionate about. So, hi.
And actually, before we start, I think what would actually be interesting, maybe raise your hand if you're a founder. Okay, quite the majority. And then raise your hand if you're an operator. Okay, cool. Okay, nice. Then we have a good idea.
Founders.
Yes, which is very nice. So thanks for taking your Thursday evening and spend it with us. And yeah, I mean, Max, we've been fortunate to work together for a number of years. I remember like 5 years ago, tried quite aggressively to invest in you, and very happy that we became partners along the way. And before we kick off, maybe you just do a quick intro from your side and share a little bit about how Taktile came about.
Yes, sure. So, I mean, my background originally was between math, stats, and finance. Been coding on the side most of my life, and then got a PhD in the US, which is important for the story later on. And then after that, joined a company. Friends of mine had started as a founding ML engineer. It was very similar, I would say, or I will not say what it's similar to. I will say we were building machine learning driven software for insurance companies, e-commerce companies, banks, etc. And that was also a US business operating in both geos. So we've always been thinking about this topic pretty much from day one. And then at some point, Mike and I, my co-founder, we realized we want to take the learnings, but turn that into a platform that we would have liked to use ourselves to make our lives easier. And that's how the idea for Taktile was born. So we started that in 2020, did Y Combinator in the summer, and then been going from there.
Awesome. And I think what's quite interesting is you almost actually, I don't know whether you would call it a boomerang, but you started pretty global from the get-go. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, there's a lot of boomerangs in the story because I moved from Boston to Berlin, and then we worked here for the first company, and then we did YC with the intention of actually moving to San Francisco. But then COVID hit in March 2020, and we had gotten in just after or just before, but we couldn't move because there was a travel ban, and the travel ban was in place for 18 months or so, for a pretty long time. So we're the first remote batch in YC, and then we thought, well, do we call it off? I mean, we're going to have a Great Depression, and should we just, wait it out? But in the end, we thought, screw it, we're just going to try. But the only option at the time was doing it from Berlin. So that's what we did. But we had this Delaware C Corp set up even before YC. So we were always this American company transplanted to Chausseestraße, close to here, sitting around trying to build a business. And then our first customer actually was American.
Yeah, tell us about that.
I mean, this is almost like a cliche, I would say. I mean, everything you say in your slides is very true for us, but we got introduced to this company called Branch, and they do finance in emerging markets out of Silicon Valley. So we got in touch, we showed them the product, they kind of liked it, and then I still remember at some point late in the sales cycle, I talked to the CTO, sort of the end game, and it was our first big contract, our first contract really at the time, and then he looks at me and says, I assume I'm between customer 1 and 5. He clearly knew he was customer 1, but he didn't want to embarrass us in front of everybody else. And I looked at him, I said, yes. And he's like, okay. And then we did it, which was amazing for us.
And I guess kind of also for the customers later on, kind of, yeah, how did that differ, I guess, to some of the German companies that you've worked with? What did you notice? I guess, how did you also, did you have to adjust anything kind of in the way you went to market in the US, or?
Yeah, I think the stereotype is that Americans are much more value-oriented in a sales process when they buy products. And I think that's also true for us. They really go in and say, what's in it for me? And if you don't have a good story, quickly, they also tune out very quickly. So you have to be really crisp on why they would buy the freaking thing and what's in for them. But if you show them something that can generate value, they're also very sort of ROI driven, and they say, well, okay, show me the value, prove the value, and then we can talk about the risk and you're a small company and this and that. But it's a very rational sort of thing around technology adoption, and I think they also culturally, they are very worried about falling behind compared to their competitors, because things move faster there too. They're more attacked by challenges. There's more big tech trying to eat their lunch, etc. So I think they are more culturally sensitive towards, we have to adopt these things, even if it's risky to stay on top, which is something that I think here, when we sell to very difficult customers, banks, insurance companies, I think here there's a lot more risk aversion when it comes to working with small companies.
Which I realized we didn't even talk about what Taktile actually does. So maybe we take that step back so you know what the product actually is and who you guys are selling to and what the value proposition is.
Yeah, so we are building we call it an AI decision platform. So it's a place where banks and also insurance companies can run their critical automated decisions. Think of things like fraud checks, credit checks, money laundering detection, all the things that need to be running really, really fast, that are really important, where if you get it wrong, you're in deep trouble. And they're quite driven by domain experts. So it's not just an automation thing, but it's really driven by somebody who understands the domain and wants to know how the decisions are made. And we've built a platform where you can inject the right data sources, so it can be external, internal data. You can run your rules, so there's a rules engine to inject your strategy and your preferences. There's then a machine learning and AI component to have also statistical or predictive aspects in this. And then there's also case management for having human review, because a lot of the AI use cases, they do require human sign-off, especially when you are taking things away from people. So it's a modular system geared towards these critical use cases in the financial services.
And well, so you have your first customer in the US, but you're still you still have the team in Berlin in Chausseestraße.
Schönhausallee.
Schönhausallee by now. But then how did that develop over time? So for you guys, I think it's been quite a gradual journey. It wasn't that you woke up and you said, okay, now somebody needs to move to the US. So how was that journey?
Yes, so we had these US customers from day one. And then once the travel ban was lifted, especially my co-founder, but also myself, we tried to go to the US more often, see customers, do sales, etc. And then at some point, Mike said, look, I think I got to spend way more time there, just because we felt like that's where the market is. It's by far the biggest market. And there's just so much value in being in person still, at least in our segment. But at the same time, we had a team here that was working, and we didn't want to abandon the team and just move everything to the US, which I think would have been very rough. And I think it's also, there's value in having R&D in Europe once you've built it, because there are lots of talented people here. So then we decided that we'll keep this dual strategy where he moves to the US, builds out especially the go-to-market side in New York City, and then we keep R&D in the European time zone. We didn't want to have R&D split across time zones because of productivity and that being very annoying.
And I guess what were some of the advantages and disadvantages of having that setup? Go-to-market largely in the US, product and R&D largely in Europe.
I think a big advantage is you have access to a talent pool for R&D in Europe that is very hard for other people to tap, and there are a lot of strong people in Europe you can work with. I think another advantage of having our go-to-market in the US is you have access to the biggest, by far the biggest market for us. You said 2x the SaaS market, but then if you look at addressability, who will actually buy from you, and then you look at our space, I think it's probably more like 4x or so. So we just have to win there. Otherwise, somebody else is going to win the segment. I mean, we do have competition, so if somebody else cracks the US, they will then expand globally and kill us. So we have to be in the US and be there early. So I think there's no choice really, other than being in the US with a go-to-market team.
And the first customer, I guess, was really an early believer, but if you think about some of the next customers, did you have to make yourself look American at all? Or like, I think that's something that comes up with a lot of founders too, is like, do I need a post address there? Do I need to hire somebody who's American? Or how do you get people to choose you versus some of the local competitors?
Yeah, I think it's hard when both founders are German to pretend being all American, but we did always put New York City as the first office on the slide. We always put the American stuff front and center to at least show people we're an international company, which is what we are. And it's not like they don't only buy from American companies. There are lots of big companies built out of Europe. So it's definitely possible, but it was important to not look like a German company. I think that would be pretty bad, which we also are not.
Got it. And now today you're split across 2 continents. So you have a team in the US, you have a team in Berlin, you also have by now a few other kind of little offices in Europe. How have you handled culture and communication? What were some of the learnings for you there to actually bring, I guess, the tactile spirit to the US, to build a cohesive culture? What were some of the learnings? What were some of the principles?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think one thing that everybody says who does this is you have to transplant one of the founders there. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard to inject the same energy and urgency and culture also in these offices. I think it's really, really hard to do that remotely. So that was one thing. Generally, the way we're set up is that we tend to do all our meetings in the afternoon, so we give people a lot of flow time in the mornings in Europe. And then in the US, it's the reverse, where they have all the meetings in the mornings, and then they have a lot of time in the afternoons. So it's actually quite nice as a setup to say all the company meetings are compressed in this one band of time. We do on-sites. So once a year, we bring everybody to the same place. Doesn't matter which team you're in, etc. That's also a big factor. And then we also do another on-site for the departments, which we have split departments, like our forward-deployed engineering team is split across markets, sales team is split, our BDR team is split, so they also come together one more time every year. And we put a lot of emphasis. We spend a lot of money on bringing people together, but I think it's money well spent.
And for the roles, like how do you, I guess like squarely product and tech is in Europe and go-to-market is in the US, but for some of the roles, how do you decide where to hire them? And like, do you ever get tempted to hire someone in a place where your, I guess, philosophy would actually not lead you to hiring that person there? And how do you make these trade-offs?
Yeah, good question. I think in the US, you get most roles because there are good companies in pretty much any sector, so you can hire whatever you want. I think New York versus Bay Area, I think there's a bit more talent on the technical side in Bay Area than New York, but there's lots of good people in New York. In Europe, I think the talent that's scarce also in Berlin for us is people who have just seen what's next. which is a journey sort of enterprise software going towards 100 million in revenue, something like this. In Berlin, we tried earlier, but I think there's less than 10 companies that are relevant. So as a consequence, there are also very few people who've done it before. So I think there's a bit of shortage there. We opened London as an office partially because we think there's a deeper bench of people for specialized things.
And what we also haven't really talked about, and I guess just, I think for you that came pretty natural, is how you actually chose New York versus San Francisco or any other place. And how did you, what was your thinking there?
Yeah, I think really only two factors. One being financial services is centered around New York more so than San Francisco, and then time zone. I knew a founder from Berlin who's done San Francisco, Berlin for a long time, and it's just a shit show. I think it's really hard when you by default have no overlap in the time that you can collaborate with your peers.
And then if I think a little bit about what are the roles that you hired in the US, which were obviously a lot of go-to-market roles, we talked about that a little bit earlier. What were, I guess, some of their learnings? How did you approach that, and what went well, what went wrong?
Yeah, good question. I think coming from Europe or Germany specifically, I think you're always impressed how eloquent many Americans are, especially in sales. So I think you have to recalibrate a bit what your expectations are, because people are really, really good at selling, which is good. But I think you also have to be a bit careful with how you evaluate that. Generally speaking, I think the other thing, the moment you move to the US, there's a sticker shock off. I mean, salaries in New York are just very different from salaries in Europe. Cost of living is also very different in New York. So you have to be prepared for that, because if you go there and you try to save money on comp, you're also not going to get these people. And then what's the point?
What were maybe some, if you reflect on some of the other learnings, what were some of the mistakes that you made? What were some of the things that, if you could tell yourself while you were figuring it out, like, okay, this is how I would do it?
Yeah. I mean, I think we probably should have done it a bit earlier even. I think going earlier would have helped us also really iterate more quickly, just because density is so much higher. In our segment, there are not that many relevant customers in Berlin. So you don't get this water cooler moment of, you go to the happy hours and you meet 5 relevant people every single time. So I think for finding PMF, it's really nice if you're in a place where a lot of your customers are, so you can just iterate super, super quickly. I think that slowed us down to be in Berlin for a long time in the early days. I think we could have done that also by traveling a lot more. But I think just being in the market, being local, being with the people, it just speeds up the iteration cycle, which is the only thing that matters early on.
And if you think also, again, going back to when you spend more and more time in the US, where did you get your advice from? Like, what, obviously, like, here's, like, now we would recommend people to read the book, etc. But how did you, I guess, find peers or people that you could chat to?
I mean, Index has, of course, been very, very helpful.
That's not what I wanted to call for, but I'll take it.
No, seriously, I think you meet a lot of other founders at a similar stage. Usually, I think it's most helpful to talk to somebody who's just ahead of you, maybe a year ahead of you, 2 years ahead of you. And then you meet people who've done the same, and they can tell you about their journey. I mean, Incident was, I think, half a year ahead of us or so. So we talked to them a lot about, what they did, what worked, what didn't do. And the same with other companies we know from portfolios, friends, etc. I think that's still the best source of information on these things.
And now, maybe final question from my side, and then I would love to open it up for the audience, which is actually something that came to mind that we didn't discuss so much is, I mean, you actually have a background in ML and AI, then you actually started Taktile more as like a classical B2B software company, and now you're bringing AI back into the product. I guess with everything that has happened the last 18 months, like what has changed for you, and has anything there kind of changed for you when you look at US versus Europe?
Yeah, I think the willingness to adopt in the US right now is way bigger than in Europe, especially enterprise. I think if you go to a startup or tech company, it's fine. You can sell in Europe too. If you go to a bank in Frankfurt and you tell them you want to put some AI into their risk processes, they're not going to be super enthusiastic. That's at least my experience. Whereas I think in the US, with what the administration is doing, and I think all the big tech companies being there, people are much more forward on adoption and also just willing to try things out. That's also an argument to be there.
Sounds good. Any parting advice before we move to Q&A?
I mean, I think the one thing that I think I wish I had known early is the only thing that matters, the only thing is get your customers. I mean, get your first 10 customers, make them really, really happy. And the only way to do it is be with them as much as you can. I think that everything else is just a distraction.
Nice. Thank you.
All right, first, you were quick.
Sure, happy to. My name is Artem. I'm from Latvia, lived in the US, have been living in Germany, Berlin specifically for 10 years. Thanks for the perspectives. I have two questions. One, how did you and how are you still managing the co-founder relationship? In my experience, it's such a it kind of needs to be such a synchronous relationship that I'm curious to hear how you've managed that across continents in the beginning and now. And the other question is around, there's a bifurcation of geographies, right? It's sort of US for its own, Europe for its own, and China and everybody else for their own. And there's this kind of philosophy of, well, European founders need to be building in Europe for Europe. And then there's the opposite of that as well, of who cares, build a global company, bring the money back. Would love to hear your take on both of those.
Yeah, so I think on the co-founder relationship, I agree that's probably one of the most dangerous things if you don't manage it and it breaks apart, just because it's hard to replace. My co-founder and I, we knew each other for a long time beforehand. We had studied together in the US, we had worked together, we were on the same team in the previous company. So for us, there was a pretty strong trust base. And I think something I didn't appreciate at the time, but also just complementarity in skills, but also in interests, in terms of I would not like to do what he does all day, and he would definitely not like to do what I do all day. So I think that also helps a lot in having a symbiotic relationship going forward. We still do our one-on-one every week. We talk for an hour. Sometimes we talk on the weekends. He's the godfather of my child, so it's good.
He also travels still a fair back and forth, right?
I think last year he had like 150 flights or something. It was pretty absurd. On the second one, I think building in Europe for Europe, it can work depending on the product and the segment you're selling to. So for us, it's a pretty generic product that you can use across markets, across segments. So we are competing with American companies. In that case, I think it's important to be in the US because it's the biggest market. Otherwise, somebody else is going to scale there. They're going to have more resources, a better product, and then they're going to crush you later. If you do something that's very segmented, think of, HR information systems. If you think of Personio, I think they had a really good right to play in Europe because it is a different animal to build an HR system for the European market versus the US market. So that can be a smart strategy to carve that out for yourself. Fintech, I think, is similar, where it's very regional. So people build for the region. And then at some point, maybe they try to go to the US. But it depends a bit on what you're trying to do.
There was one question here, some of you. Yeah, yes.
Thank you. My name is Ivan. Maximilian, thank you so much for an amazing case study. Could you please tell us a couple of words about your background, your education, and how this has helped you to build this successful company?
Yeah. It's always hard to say what the kind of factual is on these things and how much it helped versus it was just, it just happened. But so I studied a mix of math and stats and economics, but I'd always been, building websites, etc. on the side. I never did CS, which is a bit of an omission, but kind of worked out anyway. And then machine learning was a really good mix of these things because do some coding, but also some of the statistical aspects, working with data, which I always really enjoyed. So I became good at, I think, working with data, but also managing the business domain, which in applied work, I mean, it's super essential to map this technical stuff to the business side. What's the value? How does it work in practice? How can it fail, etc. And I think that's the thing that really helped me, or still helps me a lot. So just bridging the technical side with the business side, which is a big part of my job still. So being a jack of all trades, I think is useful when you start a company.
You and Mike also both lived in the US before starting the company, right? Because you both studied there.
That's right. So I think we had more affinity than most people. We had friends there, we have mentors there, we knew people, so it was a bit easier. But if you don't have that, I think there's still a case for trying to sell in the US. And if it makes sense for your business, I would encourage trying that.
Hi, my name is Michael. I'm asking more from the technical perspective from the AI. Which role, how big was the part AI played itself in your success, your product?
Yeah, you know, it's for us, it's also a boomerang case. We started really machine learning forward, and we struggled quite a bit with that pitch because a lot of problems, to solve them really end to end, you need more than that. So then at some point, we talked to a lot of customers, we're really close to them, realized, well, actually, not so many labels, data is kind of crap, but they all struggle with data access. So we built a layer for data access, integrating with all the fraud vendors and credit bureaus and doing really painful work to integrate data, but they loved that. That's great, we got some traction. Kept talking to people, then they said, actually, now I have this data, build me a rules engine. And that was heartbreaking because we were doing all this ML stuff and there's all this story around, you know, learn things, replace the rules and the death of the expert system, etc. And we were like, wait, are we going back in time now? So that didn't feel good, but when you actually look at the problems they're trying to solve, you just cannot learn these problems. I mean, they have no history, they're launching a new product, they have a strategy, they have regulatory obligations, they just have to code this up. So we built that purely based on demand. Felt terrible emotionally, but it worked. And then it really took off. At that point, we had a lot of customers that were using zero ML. So it was data and rules, and it worked really well. But it was kind of weird starting life as an ML company and then not having any ML in a lot of use cases. And now with LLMs, we're doing a boomerang back. We have a lot of traction for people who want to do LLM-enabled use cases. And that can be automation of things humans do today, document-related use cases, also reasoning-related use cases where people try to make sense of data that's a bit ambiguous. So we get a lot of traction right now, and we're bringing it back in, which feels great.
What's up, everybody? My name is Togara Hess, Hess. Yeah, I'm a full-stack web dev. I've been doing this for 5 years, and since I became a developer and put my CV on the market, I got a whole lot of job offers from Silicon Valley when they found out I was in Berlin, right? And I was the cheap labor, so to speak. The asking price for, you know, my monthly and annual salary would, you know, be shadowed and really minute compared to US salary prices. So is that something that you take into account? You know, whether you'd like to found and start your business here or run it from here with cheaper labor, so to speak, cheaper labor here in Germany. And then just to take that question further, it's no wonder or secret that in India, there are pretty much the best programmers in the world that would do what we do for a fraction of the price. Is there a reason why y'all don't go for the cheaper option that's more economical and you'd have a better product? Yeah, I don't know if I framed this question in the right way, but I think you catch my drift. Shout out for the space, everybody.
Awesome. Yeah, I think optimizing for the cost of labor in a startup doesn't make much sense, to be honest, because if you start out, the chance of failing is pretty high. It's like, whatever, 90% or so. So the only thing that really matters is finding product market fit really fast. So that's the only thing to optimize for. And you know, VC money, pre-seed money is pretty available nowadays. So I'd rather think about what's the team you need to get product market fit as fast as possible. Probably less than 10 people. Because once you have more than 10, you have to do all the management and recruit them. And it makes it actually slower to find it. So if you need 10 people, it almost doesn't matter how much you pay them because you can raise enough money to pay 5 or 10 people if you have some traction. So I don't think this idea of, oh, you go to a cheap place to have a bit more runway at the early stage makes a lot of sense. I think it makes sense if you're Accenture and you hire 5,000 engineers to do relatively straightforward stuff. Okay, maybe, but I don't think that's a consideration that should matter a lot in the early days.
Okay, we have 3 questions. There's you, and then you.
Thank you. I'm Raphael, and I was wondering, because you mentioned the Delaware company, what would be the ideal organizational setup in terms of entities when you start essentially in both markets?
So I can tell you what the standard Y Combinator structure is that everybody does who's from Europe, which is they have a Delaware C Corp as a holding company, then they have an operational company as a limited GmbH in Germany. That's the standard thing. It's relatively well established how it works. The one downside is you gotta make sure you operate the Delaware C Corp from the US. So you gotta fly to the US for your board meetings, etc., which is expensive. That's, I think, the one slight caveat there. But other than that, practically speaking, you operate your GmbH the same way you do it with a normal startup setup. And then at some point, you add a US operational company, which is typically an LLC in the US, in Delaware, New York City, San Francisco. You can pick one, doesn't matter. And then you can hire people into that entity in the US. The nice thing with this is you don't need to flip. So you can also start a GmbH and then at some point have an LLC in the US underneath. But then it means that you will always have your center of gravity here. And it's a bit easier in the US with investors, DocuSign, documentation. Once you do a Series B or so, there's just more precedent for how to do that. Our documentation has always been trivial because it's like, oh yeah, everything's standard. Yes, cool, thank you. And you sign DocuSign and that's kind of it. Which in here is not the case. So that's the standard setup. It's a bit expensive in the early days, but it makes sense to avoid the flip.
Thank you so much for speaking with us. My name is Malfo, and I'm from the US, Tennessee specifically. I'm really interested in your background in academia, specifically the transition in mentality from going from a very bureaucratic environment to now running running a startup and starting it from scratch. I kind of want to know, was there any kind of like mental gymnastics for kind of getting out of that academic environment to now scaling something by yourself?
Yeah, I would challenge the premise that academia is bureaucratic. For me, the experience in the US was extremely entrepreneurial, actually, in that they give you money and they give you time, and then they say, make something interesting. It's actually quite a hard experience for me, and I think I learned a lot of frustration tolerance there, because most things in research, they take a long time, they're quite lonely, they actually end up not working, and people are not interested in it, and you just have to keep going, keep trying, which is very similar to an early stage startup. So I think for me, it actually helped as an experience. Yeah, I think if you go to, I don't know, a very large corporation, I think that's a different game then.
Thanks. My name is Angelina. I'm a founder at Side2Side, and we essentially do a little bit similar to what you guys do, data integrations, but for biotech and pharma. And so the market is somewhat similar. It's highly regulated environment, and I would be really curious to learn a bit more about how you won your first 5-10 customers. So did you do cold outreach? What channels did you use and such? Thanks.
Yeah, I think it was all warm through friends, people we knew, friends of friends, people you talk to, you refer to, etc. I think the very first 5 or 10 customers we all got through the network, which I still think is the most efficient way if you can. And then now we have a lot of different channels. I think for us, conferences still work amazingly well. So if you're in an industry where people go to conferences, it's also a good thing to do early because you can book 20 meetings for a given day. So you learn more in a single day than you normally learn in 2 weeks or so. So that was a surprising thing for me post-COVID, that people still show up at conferences. But definitely very efficient to talk to a lot of people.
So we have the American barbecue is waiting for us. So I would take 2 more questions, maybe. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ferdinand. Thanks for giving all your perspectives. What are some of the transatlantic learnings your European sales team had from launching and scaling in the US and unlocking a stronger go-to-market motion in Europe consequently?
I think what we can learn from the US is they're very good at distilling things, using very simple language to express what you're trying to do. I think that's not if you go to school in Germany, you go to a gymnasium, they teach you to write in a fancy way, and the longer the sentence, the better, etc. And I think this is, in the US, they're proud of the simplicity, right? Simplicity is good because it really means you've distilled the essence and you've cut all the noise. So I think that's something that I admire with American writing style. And you also see this in pitch decks, you see this in documentation, you see this on the website. I think they're often very good at being really crisp on what it's all about.
Hi, thank you for your insights. I think they are very valuable. My name is Adriana. I'm from Mexico, and I would like to dig deeper into the acquisition of the first customer, because I think, as you mentioned it, like redefining the pitch, it transition over time, also the solution. So what actually you pitched to them, and at the end, what you pitched to them was the solution that you built for them? And how was, if it was not, how was the transition with them towards the product? I mean, did you arrive with a finished product and then you were like, it's not working beautifully, let's change it?
Yeah, great question. So there's this, the mantra of doing things that don't scale in the early days. And with this customer, it was a standard example of that, which was that they had just fired a lot of people because they had some, economic challenges, and then they were just struggling with a bunch of their processes. And we went in and we just helped them solve it. And a lot of it was also me helping the guys code up some stuff that was not even in our code base. It was literally very, very, very hands-on to get them to use our product. And I think that's totally fine. Like, the first thing is find a problem that's worth solving, that people pay your money for. And maybe you solve it in a non-scalable way once, maybe 3 times, maybe 5 times. As long as you have a path towards doing that in somewhat scalable way later, that's totally okay. I think it's very dangerous to think you have to build because it's actually fun to build without knowing what you're building for. So hitting the market earlier with a pretty janky product, I think, is generally a good strategy, because chances are you built the wrong thing anyway.
Which that is maybe like one more thing just to talk 30 seconds about, because it came to mind because we talk about that a lot, is how you actually trade off from a product side between what customers want and what unlocks basically getting new customers in versus the product roadmap that you actually want to build towards.
Yeah, I mean, both. No, I think you have to do both, right? It's not like you're going to push great customers sort of out of your sales cycle. But if you only do what they want incrementally, you might never get to the thing that really accelerates the company. And I think with AI and specifically, I think there's a case where you have to build a bit ahead of what the models can do today. You have to build a bit ahead of what people are asking you to build because they don't quite know what's possible. So I think there's a balance there. I think you can't do 0 on either. And then you gotta balance it, yeah. But it's a tough one.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And also thank you so much for all the great questions. And yeah, we'll stick around for a little bit. I hope you enjoy the barbecue. And again, thanks for spending your Thursday night with us. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you.